June 25th, 1876, the day General Custer's legend died, and the truth was buried. For 150 years we've been fed the same story of heroism and tragedy. But what if it was all a lie? Tonight you'll hear history scream through the voice of a man silenced for generations. Running Wolf, the Arikara warrior who stood beside Custer and lived. His eyewitness account, hidden in military archives for a century, shatters every myth you know. The soldiers didn't die heroes. They died terrified and outnumbered. We found their heads smashed like pumpkins. And Custer? His last order doomed them all. This isn't Hollywood's last stand. This is the brutal truth, revealed by the only man who could tell it. Stick with us. What you learn will change how you see American history. Forever. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. Running Wolf joined the Army in spring 1876 at Fort Lincoln with 6 other valiant warriors: Young Hawk, Horns in Front, Tall Bear, Foolish Bear, Red Foolish Bear, and Charging Bull. They were guided by Big John, an experienced Iroquois scout who led them from Fort Berthold, staying overnight at Fort Stevenson, where Big John himself was in command. Then they traveled to a location just north of modern Washburn, arriving at Bismarck by midday and crossing the river by steamboat. The next morning, Gerard took them to headquarters for formal enlistment. They first camped at the hill's base, but shortly moved to join the soldiers at a camp set farther back from the river. During their stay, they discovered Custer was away in Washington and were told the expedition would start upon his return. It began 6 days later, whereupon Bobtailed Bull and Soldier were called to headquarters. Bobtailed Bull was made sergeant. Gerard instructed them to ready for the parade, where they would march Indian fashion, singing their traditional songs, marking the start of the first day's journey. Post-parade, the scouts headed the column, trailed by Custer and the White Cavalry. Varnum, the chief of scouts, camped with the scouts, bringing an orderly and a cook. The Army paused at noon and stayed until dawn. Stopping for dinner the following day, rain started, preventing further travel. The next morning, they moved on, setting up a second camp west and north of the Heart River on a broad flat, named Camp No. 2. The subsequent day, they advanced again. Scouts termed the camp Turkey Buzzard Camp. From there, 2 scouts, One Horn and Red Foolish Bear, were sent with mail. Soldiers had received pay at the first camp, and a cattle herd traveled with the force. Next, they advanced to Big Mountain for dinner, establishing Camp No. 4 in a spacious valley. The day after, they dined on the open prairie, forming Camp No. 5, at present-day Hebron. At the dinner halt the next day, rain compelled them to camp nearby, close to Young Man's Butte, Camp No. 6. Dinner was eaten the subsequent day on a muddy flat. Roads proved too heavy for the loads, forcing the Army to camp there, Camp No. 7, beyond Young Man's Butte. The Army dined next day at a coulee east of modern Dickinson, setting up Camp No. 8. There, late at night, Red Foolish Bear arrived, reporting he had left Red Bear behind with an exhausted horse. Bobtailed Bull headed a group to recover Red Bear, bringing him back at daybreak. The next day, the Army entered the Badlands, forming Camp No. 11 just inside. Wood was cut and hauled along for bridge building. Next morning's instructions specified each man must carry his own provisions. Camp No. 12 was set up in the Little Missouri Valley near Soldier Butte. The next day, they advanced past the butte and formed Camp No. 13. Snow fell overnight there, piling up 2 to 3 feet deep. The force stayed put all that day and the next night. By the following day, the snow had largely thawed. Consequently, they pressed on through mud and slush, which strained the teams, along a ridge with a flat top. Near the ridge's end, around noon, they met Crow Bear, a Grosvenor scout riding a horse who had come from Powder River with mail. After eating dinner, he went back the way he came. There was no dinner stop that day, and the column moved down a coulee to Beaver Creek, creating Camp No. 14. The day after, they traced Beaver Creek to its head and pitched Camp Number 15. The following day's advance occurred over the open prairie, a level area, and far off they sighted the Blue Hills. Camp Number 16 was formed upon the open prairie. They marched on toward the Blue Hills, toward a coulee containing cottonwoods, Camp Number 17, which the Dakota Scouts called Cottonwood Creek. By dinner time, they got to the foothills and, after eating and moving again, continued until they reached the spot where Powder River meets the Badlands. Here they established Camp Number 18. In the morning, Custer appeared at Varnum's tent and called for Bobtail Bull, directing him to send 7 scouts forward to look for Dakota signs, 4 Dakota scouts and 3 Iroquois. The Iroquois scouts sent out were Young Hawk, Forked Horn, and One Feather. The Dakota scouts were Kuru, Martaksha, Buffalo Body, and White Cloud. Some white troopers went with them, advancing in 2 columns. The orders were clear: not to come back until they found recent signs of the Dakotas, and to report at the base camp located at Powder River's mouth. Camp Number 19 was formed at the Powder River mouth, where a steamboat stood. 2 unwell scouts, Horns in front, and Charata remained at this camp in Tall Bear's care. A store tent, managed by a white man, offered deer hindquarters to the soldiers for $4 apiece. The wagons stayed here, protected by troops. The army marched onward to Tongue River, camping about 2.5 miles from its mouth, naming it Camp Number 20. Here, the scouts sent a report to Custer outlining their findings. They crossed the Tongue River and climbed to a plateau, forming Camp Number 21. The next day, they camped on a level-topped rise, located far from the Rosebud and 1 mile from the Elk River, Camp Number 22. Camp Number 23 was positioned on elevated land, about a 1/4 mile above the Rosebud River's mouth. Camp Number 24 was set up on the flat at the Rosebud mouth. Next morning, Custer and his brother Tom came to the scout camp to talk with Soldier, Bobtail Bull, and Bloody Knife, using Gerard as interpreter. While they were there, Young Hawk informed them of a recent Dakota trail and camp found by the river. At the same time, the steamboat arrived, unloading crates of hardtack crackers, which were being broken open. The bugle blew, and the scouts saddled their horses, going to the crackers and loading their leather saddlebags with provisions. Custer was occupied writing messages, and 6 scouts were chosen to carry them to the base camp at Powder River mouth. The scouts picked for this task were Foolish Angry Bear in command, Running Wolf, Howling Wolf, Curly Head, Goose, and Young Hawk. However, upon hearing the party's makeup, Custer held back Young Hawk and Goose, acknowledging their skill in trailing the Dakotas and their shooting ability. The dispatches were readied, and the 4 scouts tasked with their delivery received Custer's orders to stay at the base camp once their job was done. This happened around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The scouts assigned to this duty were unwilling to go back to the base camp, wishing instead to stay with the main column. They rode all through the night, ate breakfast, and traveled all day, and the next night, until, at sunrise, they saw the wagons at the base camp 1.5 miles off. 2 Iroquois scouts charging up the hill in wagon, who had remained at Fort Lincoln, rode out from the camp to greet them. They talked together for a while before continuing to the base camp. Upon reaching it, around noon, the 6 scouts were promptly detailed to take dispatches from Fort Lincoln to Custer, joined by a white trooper. Running Wolf headed this scout group, which included Howling Wolf, Horns in front, Tall Bear charging up the hill, and Curly Head. After eating dinner, they began their trip back, riding until midnight, when weariness forced them to make camp for rest. The next morning they set off again, arriving at a good place to camp by the Rosebud at evening. The following morning they reached the Rosebud mouth, where the crackers had been unloaded, and spotted men far off, who they thought were Dakotas. So they quickly turned into the woods on the Rosebud, staying there till sundown. Tall Bear then proposed going back to the base camp, but the soldier, using gestures and a few Dakota terms, showed they were required to take the dispatches to Custer. He suggested crossing the Rosebud after dark and going around the presumed Dakotas, thus advancing to Custer. They obeyed him, fording the Rosebud, where the water came up to their armpits. Traveling all night, they got there around 4 o'clock the next day, seeing the soldiers camp at the Bighorn mouth. They believed this was Custer's trail, as dark had hidden his route, and they dreaded the Dakotas, who they thought they'd seen at the Rosebud mouth. Unknown to them, the people seen were actually Strike Two's group, withdrawing to the base camp from the Little Bighorn battle. At the Bighorn camp, the scouts heard the Custer fight's result. Terry, called Bearcoat by the Iroquois for his bearskin coat, led this camp. The scouts gained this information, though Running Wolf can't remember who shared the news. The steamboat had gone up the Bighorn, carrying wounded and survivors from the Custer fight. This news was received around midday. Soon after, 2 scouts from the base camp, Crow Bear and a white soldier, came, bringing word of Strike Two's party and their tale of defeat and casualties. The account stated all white soldiers and some scouts were slain. Crow Bear then listed the dead scouts: Bloody Knife, Bobtailed Bull, Little Brave, Forked Horn, Red Foolish Bear, Young Hawk, and Goose, since they were missing from the 2 groups retreating to the base camp. Crow Bear and the white soldier were immediately sent back to the base camp with dispatches. Terry then visited the scout camp, giving Running Wolf a pair of binoculars and telling him to go up the Bighorn to the hills and watch for the returning steamboat. Terry's bearskin coat had made a lasting mark on the veteran scouts, who recalled him for this unique garment. Running Wolf, with Charging Up the Hill, rode away to perform this task. When they came back at night, they reported no boat was visible. The next morning, Terry came to the camp again, repeating the same orders and handing Running Wolf his own binoculars. Terry also directed Howling Wolf to go with Running Wolf to determine if the steamboat was coming. Upon their return for dinner, Running Wolf gave the glasses back to Terry. Later, around 3 or 4 p.m., Running Wolf heard a loud whistle upstream, signaling the steamboat's approach. The scouts and everyone went to the bank, where they saw a white canvas covering the whole deck, under which wounded soldiers rested in the shade. On the boat's front, they saw Strikes the enemy, the injured Crow Scout. The soldiers began unloading the wounded, placing them on canvas spread on the shore. As this task neared its end, Running Wolf saw Goose near the engine room, his hand injured and bandaged, with a blanket over his shoulders. Running Wolf, with another scout, helped Goose up the bank. Goose told of their clash with the Sioux. "We fought bravely, but were surrounded by the foe in the woods. Luckily, we got away alive." He added, "The other scouts are coming on foot, behind the boat." Soon the white survivors appeared, followed by the 4 scouts: Young Hawk, Red Foolish Bear, Forked Horn, and Half Yellow Face, the Crow Scout. As Young Hawk neared, he started telling the story of the battle. "Bloody Knife, Bobtailed Bull, and Little Brave are dead," he said. "We found the first 2 bodies, their heads terribly crushed, but Little Brave's body we couldn't find." Young Hawk led the spotted pinto, once Little Brave's horse, as he shared his account of the fight in the timber and what happened next in the gully. Next morning, the wounded soldiers with Goose got on the boat, and Terry and the chief with a red nose took charge. They told the scouts to follow the Yellowstone's east bank and look for a Dakota crossing to the west side. The scouts, including Forked Horn, Horns in Front, Red Foolish Bear, Charging Up the Hill, Tall Bear, Young Hawk, Running Wolf, and Wagon, started this task, leaving Curly Head and Howling Wolf back in Terry's camp. After 10 days, they came back to Terry's camp, but found Soldier was gone, and the camp had moved to the Rosebud mouth, joining the base camp at Powder River. The commanders ordered they must go up the Rosebud to find Sitting Bull. Halfway up the Rosebud, they met Crook, heading a group of foot soldiers and mounted scouts, made up of Arapaho or Shoshone tribesmen. Here, all the scouts assembled, including Terry, the red-nosed chief, Varnum, Crook, and their men. They followed the Dakota Trail to the Tongue River, where they camped. Next day, they went on to the Powder River, with its thick woods, and set up camp. The following morning, the surviving soldiers of Custer's command, all the Iroquois scouts and Crook's Indian scouts, marched under Terry and Varnum to the Powder River mouth, camping there. Crook's command and the other soldiers remained here, while the Crow Scouts and Crook's scouts went back to their reservations. The rest of the camp returned to Crook's camp on the Rosebud, only to find Crook had already left, chasing the Dakota Trail. The red-nosed chief and other officers came to the scout camp carrying a letter. He picked a detail of 7 scouts to take the letter to Crook, while the rest of the camp was to go back to the base camp. The 7 scouts, Soldier, Black Fox, Charging Up the Hill, Boy Chief, Young Hawk, Running Wolf, and Carew, were tasked with carrying the letter to Crook's camp. After delivering it, they found Crook was pursuing Sitting Bull's trail. Crook directed them to stay and scout for him, filing reports every second day, which they faithfully executed under his leadership. Near Beaver Creek, Running Wolf and Young Hawk went hunting on a ridge, apart from the other scouts. Rejoining their group at Beaver Creek, they met a group of Indians on foot and cavalry under a different leader. Carew had been sent to Powder River with mail, but quickly returned, carrying fresh orders. He stated that Soldier, Boy Chief, Black Fox, and Charging Up the Hill were to take over his duties, relieving him. At sunset, the 3 remaining scouts from the initial party camped together, receiving scant provisions: 2 crackers, 2 spoonfuls of coffee, and 2 spoonfuls of sugar each. Just as they were settling to sleep near midnight, the noise of nearing horses echoed. The Dakotas, riding and armed, opened fire on the camp. The soldiers, half awake and confused, came out of their tents, some weaponless, and were commanded to fall back to a nearby ridge. The Dakotas surrounded the camp, shooting continuously, while the soldiers shot back, lighting up the night. At first the cavalry stayed idle, but when bugles sounded, they moved, saddled, and entered the fight. The Dakotas finally withdrew into the dark, and the scouts stationed on a small hill had little part in the action. Next day the soldiers gave up chasing the Dakota Trail and reached Soldier Butte, setting up camp. They moved to the Little Missouri, finding a deserted Dakota campsite, and camped overnight. Around midday they came upon another Dakota camp in the woods, but the officer stopped them from attacking, choosing to camp instead on Custer's old site east of Rosebud Butte. They arrived there around 5 p.m. As evening neared, the scouts noticed unusual activity among the cavalry. Carew went to look, followed by Young Hawk, who called Running Wolf, saying, "The soldiers are preparing letters for Fort Lincoln, and we are ordered to deliver them tonight." After eating supper, they left at sunset, bearing the letters to Fort Lincoln. They rode all night, stopping to eat and care for their horses at Young Man's Butte. Continuing on, they reached Sentinel Butte after dark. They traveled through the night and next day, finally getting to Fort Lincoln as night came. Running Wolf's service ended in January 1877. I trust this eyewitness narrative offers a fresh view of the Little Bighorn Battle and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Keep watching for more videos like this. I aim to share more first-hand battle accounts, so have a fine day and see you next time.